All right, Kim, welcome and take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. I am happy to be here this evening. And as Susan said, that I'm an independent college counselor, so I work with students throughout the U.S., predominantly state of Illinois, but other states. So my goal tonight is really to help educate families about the process. And so one of the things that I feel the most passionate about is that knowledge is power. And the more you know about the process as you help guide your child, or if there are any students on the call, it just helps you make more educated decisions along the way. So, always does that if we sit too long. So let's see if it'll go through. All right. So college just ahead, and Susan did a poll, and before I clicked off the poll, it looked like the majority of the student or people that were on have juniors. It looked like a few sophomores and freshmen. So tonight's overview, we're going to touch base on impact of COVID, cost of admissions, how we look at the right fit, how to understand school selectivity, looking at an example of a highly selective admissions, and how the university's institutional goals can impact the ultimate acceptance numbers. Standardized testing, which has been kind of just a wild experience with COVID. Application components and strategy, and ultimately the money piece, because for the majority of us, we're going to have more than one child in school at the same time. And so it's important to be thoughtful about all of the costs total, as well as if it's going to be a long-term career path, something that might require grad school or med school. So, all right. So one of the things you hear a lot in the news, and I get this question regularly, is just why, what has kind of changed throughout COVID? So we touched on, I mentioned test optional. So right now, we're a few years out. Originally, when COVID first hit, a lot of the testing centers were closed. So there was really no place for these students to take the test. 99% of the universities went test optional. And other than the state of Florida, they're public institutions. So now, as we're a few years out, there are still about 50% of the universities that are test optional. I like to give a huge caveat to that. So sometimes universities will, on their website, tell students that they're test optional. But if you were applying for any what I call high impact majors, those would be engineering, computer science, business. The university may be test optional, but the College of Business, College of Engineering, et cetera, may not. So it feels a little disingenuous sometimes to me, but the universities have benefited tremendously by going test optional, and many of them will continue. Their diversity numbers are up significantly, and they feel as though they're able to attract a much wider group, a population, without having that threshold of a test score. So also during COVID, and this will continue for the class of 2024, and I think certainly through the class of 2025, there is an optional essay on the Common App, which allows your student to talk about 250 words, an optional essay about how they were impacted during COVID. So I tell families, take advantage of that. Anytime you have an optional space and you have, the ability to have your child share something meaningful with them, you can take advantage of it. So things I'll talk to my students about are, reduced leadership opportunities, potentially an impact on your grades. Sometimes students had an illness, they had COVID themselves or family members. So that impact statement is important. Student deferrals went up a lot that year. So we should be beyond that by the, as the class of 2024 applies, but the students from the class of 2022 and class of 2023 suffered from so many students deferring their admissions that it impacted future, acceptance numbers for them. I don't know why it does that sometimes. All right. There we go. All right. And then ultimately, applications to highly selective schools shot up during COVID, because with removing that threshold of a minimum test score and having to have a certain test score to be competitive, it really just opened the floodgates. So the applications, doubled and tripled at a lot of the really selective schools. And we are still seeing that in a lot of the numbers that come through. So it's important as you're building your list, and we'll talk in a few minutes about that you have a really balanced list. All right, so at the college side, for them, in terms of trying to manage the process, after COVID, they really have upped their game. And so I tell families, the nice kind of one of the silver linings of COVID is if you are researching schools, there is a wealth of information online right now. So they are going to have virtual tours, live tours, streamed information sessions, things like that. So take advantage of all of those resources. That is definitely a plus. A lot of the classes were shifting online, and as a result of that, so the universities, many of them now offer a hybrid option where your child might have the ability, if they're out sick for the day or just can't leave the dorm if they would have still COVID, to potentially go online. So that's been a plus. And then there are a lot of excessive costs that you'll see in a few minutes when we talk about, increase in the costs and numbers. And then I do think that the colleges, there was a lot of negotiating going on with that. And one of the things that has continued a little bit always since COVID is people trying to kind of adjust. So now that we're out of the remote learning, I think that's diminished a little bit, but there's still a lot of folks that are trying to get reduced tuition as a result of that. So we'll talk about cost. To me, we're going to, a few minutes, talk about fit factors, but cost is usually for most families the biggest. And so I do like to kind of just, talk about what's changed, right? So back in the day when I applied to college, or many of you, if you're parents with high school students, we applied to a few colleges, right? So there is really now, the average student that I work with usually applies to about 8 to 12 colleges. Nationally, the Common App put out a statistic, I don't remember the exact stat, but their application numbers were up, let's say 25 or 30%. The number of students applying did not increase. So that means they're applying to more than 12 schools, which is just crazy. The Common App will allow you to apply to up to 12 schools at one time. So the other thing that's kind of changed on the landscape piece of it is the testing, right? So most of us might have done an ACT or SAT. I remember really well being told, oh, tomorrow you're taking a test that'll help us figure out what's the right place for you to go to college, right? Where now most of the students that I work with and take the test about 2 to 3 times. Statistically, they say your scores aren't going to go up past that. If you are a public high school student in the state of Illinois, your child will be taking the SAT because Illinois has a contract with the College Board. So they will take one mandatory official sitting April of their junior year at their home high school. And then they might take the test at official testing sites, maybe once or twice, just to improve their score. But that has definitely created sort of this very different environment. There are a lot of different strategies now how people apply to college. So back in the day, most of the applications were due January 1st. You put them in an envelope and mailed them. And now there's a lot of different strategies of how to apply. Early decision is a strategy that definitely benefits the families, but it also benefits the universities. So I often tell families, if you think about, if you don't learn anything tonight other than the fact college is big business and the college is going to do what is in their best interest. So early decision is a binding commitment that you can make to one university. The student, parent, and high school guidance counselor sign a contract. And the contract states if the university accepts your child, they will attend. And the benefit of that for the family is it can double or triple your odds of admission in some cases. So Northwestern's admissions rate is around 5%. And with early decision, it can go to 20, I think it's 24%. And so I do think there are benefits for the families, but from the university's perspective, they are taking about 50% of their freshman class in many universities out of this early decision pool. So if you are a family that has a child or your child has an idea of what their top choice school is, and you are interested in applying early decision, I highly encourage you to reach out to the financial aid office, understand what that cost would be for you. If you sign a contract, they are having you validate in that you are able to pay for that. So you want to make sure that you're understanding if you're paying full price or not. So the strategy piece is important. The other thing that's kind of changed now is student loan debt. So part of the reason I love doing this presentation is just to make families aware, right? So a lot of people back, when school costs $5,000 or $6,000 for a whole year, were able to work a summer job and really pay for, most of college. They might have had small student loan debts. Now the average student has about $31,000 in student loan debt, and $31,000 is actually the maximum that your child can borrow through the government, and it's interest-free for all 4 years. So I'm a fan of having your child have some skin in the game. So if they are going to take out some loans, just understand that it's $31,000 for all 4 years, even though most of the least costly universities that you're going to look at are going to be about $25,000 to $30,000 per year. So it's not going to cover everything, but I think it's just really important as you're building a list, and we'll talk about financial in a minute, to understand how expensive some of these schools are. So this is just for a shock factor more than anything. And it is really just crazy that to think that, over the course of 30 years, and I kind of updated this a couple of months ago for 2022, some of these selective universities, Boston College, 14 or 15,000 up to 80, almost 81,000. Northwestern up to 82, Notre Dame 77, and U of I still is, as a in-state resident, assuming you live in Illinois, your best value. So that, as you look at these numbers, will continue to climb. The universities typically will have the cost of tuition will increase about 3% a year. So I tell families that you want to look at not just what the cost is going to be the year you start, but what it's going to be the year your child finishes. So you understand. There are a few schools. Purdue is one of the most local ones that people are familiar with, that will fix the cost over the 4 years. So freeze the cost. So you have the ability then to kind of manage your expense a little bit more. But the fit is critical. So the other thing that's changed a lot, as we talked about all those increased applications and numbers, is just looking at the statistics. So if we look at Boston College, right? So back in the 1990, they got under 12,000 applications. They're accepting more than half the students that applied. And then these are based on last year's numbers, right? Their applications have more than tripled. They're now down below 20% as an acceptance rate. And you can kind of see across the board. So we have Harvard down at 5%, Notre Dame from 43 to 15%. And the right column is USC, which is from 70% to 12%. And it's crazy. One of my partners is actually based in California, and she will say often that USC used to be something they threw on people's lists as a safety school. And so I really think that sometimes families, that they don't understand how the landscape has changed, their child builds a list and it ends up being all what I say are a lot of the reach schools. So it's really important, as you're starting to think about what your list is going to be, that it will be balanced, but understand that it's gotten much more competitive than it was back in the day. And many parents will even say, I could never get into the school that I attended anymore, right? So I think sometimes students feel that they're not doing any, the right things they need to do to get in, but the reality is that the numbers have just increased dramatically. So what's driving some of these rates? We talked about a few things already. There's twice the number of applicants, 3 times the number of international students. No, there was a dip during COVID, right, when the borders were closed, but the reality is that the majority of universities will take, international students or out-of-state students because they pay double and triple the cost, right? And so I think that as you look at the schools, like particularly for us, University of Illinois, which is our flagship, Illinois as a state has some fiscal issues. And so sometimes they are one of the schools that has a very large international population because it helps them just balance the budget. This number is actually probably a little bigger now. There's over 1,000 schools on the Common App. So the Common App is the main application platform. If some of you aren't familiar, where a lot of the students will apply to college, they have the ability to, a student has the ability to apply to up to 20 schools at one time. So what's happening is some of the schools are benefiting from that because a student can just check a box. Sometimes they have to fill out a little additional information, maybe write a supplemental essay, but it's gotten easier to apply to many more schools. And just as in an example, University of Illinois, I was telling Susan earlier, went on the Common App last year. Over the last couple of years, their application numbers are up 55%. So our own state did it partly to get more applications, I'm sure, but maybe to simplify the process for families. And as a result, it's really ended up hurting a lot of our in-state students because it's gotten more competitive for them to get in. And some of the big public schools like a University of Virginia or Washington or Georgia or the California schools will cap the out-of-state acceptances to keep spots available for their in-state students. And currently Illinois does not do that. So that's also kind of a double whammy. And then increased marketing efforts, right? So if you have a junior, you're already getting lots of mail in your inbox, your student in their email, school email or personal email, once they do some standardized testing, they're getting marketed to death. And so I like to tell families, just be aware that this is marketing. And some of it is driven by ACT and SAT, who are the two big testing agencies, or College Board runs the SAT, buying mailing lists. So they can say, we'd like to buy all the students that had test scores in this range, but it doesn't mean that your child has all the other elements that it's going to take to be successful in getting in that school, or that their test score is even going to be there. So just be aware that because Harvard is sending you an email doesn't mean that you're going to get into Harvard. Harvard is looking to drive their top line numbers as the number of applications as high as they can. Just because they only have the same number of beds available, they have to have the same acceptance, count, and it just makes them look more and more selective every year. So be aware. Next piece is rankings. So my suggestion to all of you, when I work with families, a lot of times they'll talk about, I want only top 20 schools, or I want this, or I only want these rankings. And the reality is that the rankings really should just be one small element that you look at as part of your evaluation process. I say take it with a grain of salt, because the rankings are often talking about things that aren't necessarily important to you. And I just say, I prefer personally the Wall Street Journal rankings on the right over Wall Street Journal if you are going to look at rankings. But like the alumni giving rate is 20%, right? Should that matter to you? Expert opinion 20%. That's like Harvard saying Yale's amazing and vice versa. The reality is, like, you care the most about what are the outcomes. You care a lot about what are the resources that are available on campus, financial and faculty. And, the student excellence piece is important, but understand that, and I think there's been a lot in the news lately, and I'm happy about that, how flawed some of the ranking systems are, and some of the universities that are pulling back out of those, reporting to the U.S. News and World Report as a result. So don't use that as your only element of building a school list. All right, so for us, finding the right fit when we work with a student is a combination. So the first piece is always academics. It's going to be basically do they have the program that you're interested in studying? How does the rigor of the curriculum, work with your rigor from your high school and where you would like to see yourself in the future? So sometimes if you are the best and brightest in your high school and you want to go to the best and brightest college, that may not be the best fit for you, because if you get to college and you're used to being the academic rock star and all of a sudden you're in a room of academic rock stars, sometimes that is not comfortable for students. So you want to understand how you want the rigor to be in your college experience. Admission selectivity certainly is a part of the process. We look at the ratios, class sizes. There are universities that offer support for students that have IEP and 504 plans. So be aware if that is something that your child needs, that your accommodations from high school do not carry over to college. So you will need to get updated neuropsych reports and assessments and be able to give those to the university, but also that there are universities out there that are going to be more supportive than others in that journey, if that's what your child needs to be successful. And so I encourage you to have those conversations early and look at those types of schools. Oop, I talked too long again. Okay. Oh, goodness. There we go. Sorry. So financial fit is the next leg, is our three-legged stool. So, total cost of attendance were the numbers I was sharing with you earlier. Many families have a tendency to research or Google, or sometimes on some of the database software you're looking at the tuition. And the reality is, unless they're living at home, like, we need the total cost of attendance because they have to live somewhere and eat somewhere. So always compare apples to apples. Look at what the scholarship opportunities are. And when I talk about scholarship, I mean merit scholarship opportunities. So when you're building a list and you have a balanced list, the schools where your child is on the higher academic end of the profile typically are going to be the schools that are going to try and buy their way into their heart, is how I say it to the students I work with, right? So if you have a balanced list, those merit scholarships, which are going to usually be in the $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 range, are going to be way more than your child's ever going to receive by applying to private scholarships. There are some large private scholarships out there, some through your high school potentially. Coca-Cola is a big one, but it's incredibly competitive to win those. So always go after the merit. AP acceptance policy is another huge point to look at, right? So I have students that will take, let's say, 8, 10 AP classes in high school. And if they're going to certain universities, many of those credits will transfer and they can start as essentially a sophomore. They can get their master's in 4 years, right? Where there are other schools, typically the more selective schools, that want you to take all 4 years on their campus. You still have to take those AP classes to be competitive, but they are not going to take those credits. So if cost is a big factor for you, you want to make sure you understand what the AP acceptance policy is and what score your child needs to have for them to accept those credits. 4-year graduation rate, super critical. Looking at the average, sadly, from the Department of Ed is 5.8 years to graduate. So I always say, look at what the university's 4-year graduation rate is. I have 3 children. I only want to pay for 4 years. 2 are out of college in 4 years, so that's good. I have 1 left. And hopefully for all of you, that 4 years is all you're paying for. But if the stats are low, you want to understand why. First-year retention rate is important. That's the percentage of students that come back sophomore year. So high retention rates are usually 85% and above. And that means that the university is doing a really good job of engaging the students on campus. They're getting the classes they need. The social atmosphere is good, dorms, food, etc. And then I do say there are schools that'll publish. All the schools are required to publish their, what is their student loan rate and how they're doing in managing that process. So the super selective schools are meeting 100% of demonstrated financial need, but they are not very generous with merit scholarships. So like a Boston College or a WashU, they're going to give 2% of the students maybe merit scholarships. They're meeting 100% of need because they're trying to balance out their incoming class with a really diverse pool from a financial perspective as well. And then the financial fit, I say, look at the long game. If your child is applying to a major that's going to require them to go to grad school, make sure you're budgeting for that as part of your process and get out of undergrad as inexpensively as possible. The third category is the one my students always love the most, the fun one, right? The social fit. So how big, how far, do they have Greek life, big sports? What's really important? And I do think that sometimes students focus on this piece and not so much the academic fit, but all 3 are really important. So I encourage you as a family to sit down and start talking about the schools, talk about what your budget is and how you want to, help your child through that process. But a lot of families don't have that conversation. And the analogy I like to give is, if you have a budget for $250,000 for a home, you are not going to be shopping for $1 million houses, right? So the same is true with college. So be thoughtful as you're talking to your child about what the budget is. And if you want them to have some loans as part of the process, or what that is going to look like in the end for your family. So it always breaks my heart when I hear about students applying to colleges and they get in and then their family says, oh, we can't afford that. It is so much work to apply to college that you do not want them to go through that process if they don't have to. All right, so we're talking about building a balanced school list. I'll show all these at one time. This is just obviously a really small sample of the schools, but as we're working with students to build a list, it's critical that they have a really good balanced list of likely, target, and reach schools. So I like to say this less selective category right there, accepting the majority of the students that are going to apply. Sometimes there will be programs within a university, nursing at Iowa, for example, that are going to be more selective. So as a whole, Iowa is a rolling admissions school, phenomenal. They have great other programs. The Tippy School of Business is amazing, but nursing is competitive. So if you're going to put Iowa on your list as a nursing student, it might be more in the selective category or highly selective, depending on your high school performance and your standardized testing. Selective universities, right, are accepting half or a little more of those students. So these are students that are predominantly, they might have a few C's, majority B's, some A's, but all of these schools and all of these categories, I tell students that I work with, are phenomenal schools. And there's plenty that aren't on here that are phenomenal. It is not where you go to school, it's what you do with it. And I think it's really important that as you're working to build a list, that you don't get too fixated on all the schools that are in this bottom part of the list, because it ends up being what I call this most selective category at the bottom. We often call lottery schools, right? So when you're looking at schools that are denying, I don't use the word rejected, I always say denying the majority of their applicants, it's competitive, right? So you are looking at schools that are essentially students that are applying to schools in this bottom quadrant, can do everything right, near perfect grades, near perfect test scores, really rigorous extracurricular activities. They might even have a really cool standout factor, and they are not going to necessarily be accepted. Often at the most selective schools, and I have a slide I'll show you in a minute, it is based on some things that are outside of your control to some extent as well. These universities, because they remember are big businesses, have institutional goals that you can't always know what that is, what the goal is. Some are transparent about those, some are not. So it's critical when you are working with your student to put together their list that you understand that it's got to be balanced. And then you can throw some of these Hail Mary schools on there, but just make sure that they have plenty that they're going to get into. They're also good and they'll be accepted. The other part on this slide I should mention is this OOS is out of state. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, like plenty of great public flagship schools around that will fall in. And if you're in the state of Wisconsin, you might be able to have certain stats and be accepted, but as an out-of-state student, it's going to be much more competitive. And there are also, some of these schools are hotter than others. Right now, Wisconsin is very hot for our state of Illinois students. University of Georgia is very hot. So even if you look at their overall acceptance rates, know that that is a blended rate, and they are giving 80% or more of their spots to in-state students. So that number is going to look very different. And many of them, if you do the research, will publish what their out-of-state acceptance numbers are as well. This one is super fun for me. So this is like an example of a super selective school, right? And how you can kind of slice and dice the numbers. So the Notre Dame, 21,000 applications, right? Of that, a good more than 2/3 of them are technically qualified, meaning good grades, good test scores, strong resume. They can only accept about 20% of that. So they're going to accept 4,000 students. And then they're also going to be careful, right? They're going to balance the regionality of it. They don't want all just students from the Midwest. So of that 4,000, 15% Midwest. Then they can only enroll 2,000, and you look at their targets, right? So when I said institutional goals, so Notre Dame has the first generation, meaning your parents didn't go to college, or low socioeconomic families. Those are Pell Grant eligible families that typically make $65,000-ish a year or less for a family of 4. That's a big target. Legacy, Notre Dame values, right? So that's another 20%. And then your athletic recruits. So when you look at the total numbers for Notre Dame in terms of what those acceptances are, and then understand that 46% of the spots are going to these institutional priorities, it helps you start to understand why it's important to have a balanced list, right? And why it's gotten so competitive to get into some of these schools. I will say the positive on legacy is I feel like more of the universities are starting to go away from that. Notre Dame is not one of them. A lot of the Ivies are not either. They're still very focused on that. So be aware that that is something that you need to think about as you're building the list. All right, standardized testing. So for the juniors, as I mentioned, you have the SAT coming up in April. Most of the other classes, the College Board has a suite of assessments called the PSAT. They do 9th grade, 10th grade. Of the 11th grade PSAT in the fall is the one that's called NMSQT, which means it's tied to national merit. And if your student scores very high, meaning like in the top 1%, they can qualify as a semifinalist and then potentially win some money. The money is not the point. It hasn't increased in 30 years. I think it's about $2,500, but the reality is that it's a great resume differentiator to be able to say that you're a national merit semifinalist on your application. So the PSATs are meant to be practice SATs. They're on a slightly different scale. The SAT then is the public high school for the state of Illinois students test that you'll have to take as a graduation requirement. But the other test that's out there is called the ACT. So all of the universities will accept either the ACT or the SAT. They don't have a preference. There are pros and cons to each test, that I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on today. The one thing that's noteworthy for those that have younger students, class of 2025 and younger, is that the SAT is going digital. So it will be digital. They tested it internationally over the last year. It will be digital, mandatory digital for the class of 2025 when you do your sitting at school. So that starting in the spring of 2024, they're going to be rolling that out. They're actually having there's a few sample PSATs being done for the grades, I think 10 and 9 this year electronically. That new SAT, PSAT test is going to be adaptive, which means, and it's adaptive by section. So it's like, if you get the question or the section right, or you score high enough on the section, you get a harder second section, but it doesn't necessarily allow students to, pick and choose, right? So it will definitely be interesting to see. I'm a little bit nervous. We've heard that it's harder to score high in particularly math based on this new adaptive model. So we'll see how that works out for the students. SAT subject tests went away during COVID. That used to be a way for your child to demonstrate their excellence, right? So if you were a math savant and a subject test was an 800 top score, you wanted to perform well and truthfully get an 800, right? Because at 780, you were already in the 78th percentile. So those went away. They didn't have the testing space. And so what has happened is a lot of the universities now in the testing section of your application, you can include your AP testing, assuming you did well on the test. So typically what I tell my students is if they scored a 4 or a 5, we're going to report that to sort of bolster their testing profile. If you scored a 3, some of the universities may still give you credit if you decide to matriculate to that campus, but you don't really report that on your application. That means you kind of just pass. So I think the AP testing is important. It's something that I feel like comes up early in May. If your child does have AP classes, make sure they're doing review with their teachers and the prep, because those strong scores, sometimes when I see some students that get in and some that don't, it'll be little things like that, right? And we'll talk more about letters of rec and things like that. But I do think if you have a strong SAT or ACT, and then you're supporting that with 8 5s on your AP testing, that's powerful, and that speaks a lot. The test optional, as I mentioned earlier, that, we have about 50% of the schools, there's some listed here. And many of these schools were test optional on this slide before COVID. So test optional didn't just come around with COVID. Some universities really felt as though, I like to believe they did it for the right reasons, like to improve all of the students that don't test well to be able to apply. But the slightly more skeptical side of me thinks that it also helps drive their top line numbers, and they like that it makes them look more selective. So know that sometimes they might do it for the wrong reason, but it's helpful. All right, we talked a little earlier a lot about early decision. I'm just going to put all these out here at once. So early decision was the binding opportunity that you had to apply to your top choice school and be able to improve your odds of admission. So how the timing works on this is early decision 1 applications go in around November 1st, as do early action applications, which are early but non-binding. So I tell families it's important, if you're mapping out your timeline for this, understand that the majority of this work happens over the summer into the early fall of your child's senior year. So the early action and early decision application common deadline is November 1st. Those early decision results come back out around Christmas time. So usually what happens is your child can be accepted, deferred, or denied. If they are accepted, you've signed the contract, you withdraw all your other applications and you're good to go. If you're deferred, I tell students you're a free agent again, and you have the ability then, if you wanted to apply early decision 2 to a different school. So you might have 2 top choices that offer early decision, and you can increase your odds of admission then at that second school by applying. Statistically, the colleges don't release data, but anecdotally, I know that the acceptance in the early decision 2 round is going to be slightly lower, even though they don't publish a separate number, just because the colleges really are selfish and they want to know that you're their top choice, right? So the early decision 1, if that is your dream school, is the way to go, assuming the numbers make sense for your family. Early action numbers, sometimes those results will come out. Some early ones, they'll come out in December, early January, mid-January. There was a big release last weekend of about 6 to 7, like, of the big publics. So those now are non-binding. So you get to see sort of and compare offers of merit scholarships and things like that, as well as if you're someone that would qualify for need-based aid, you would be able to see what the financial aid offering would be as well. The rolling decision option is one, like I mentioned, for Iowa. So that is schools that are accepting applications all the time. You apply today, and 2 weeks from now, you'll find out if you were accepted or not. So usually I think it's a good idea for your student to put at least one rolling decision school on their list, because it's nerve-wracking if you are waiting until January and a lot of your friends got early action notifications of acceptance or early decision, and you're hanging out there until, February or March waiting for your decisions. So that's a good point to remember. And then the bottom 2 are kind of the restricted early action is unique. So that's going to be schools that essentially are asking you to only apply early to one elite school. So these would be like the Ivy League, Notre Dame, Georgetown, and they're restricting you from applying early action to any of those other elite schools. And they actually do share the information, which feels like collusion to me, but you want to make sure you're being honest. And truthfully, the Common App now is structured in such a way it would be really difficult for you to circumvent that. But the benefit of restricted early action is you let that school know that they are your number 1 choice. Often, if you're going to be a recruited athlete, they want you to apply in the restricted early action or early decision round, but you have the ability to kind of then get your results earlier. And the last one, sorry, was regular decision, which is just straight January 1. So that is kind of the options. So application components, grades and rigor of curriculum, always number 1. And I encourage you, if you are a student that, so for the class of 2024, that was freshman year, was COVID. If it was a rocky start, talk about it. Show the university your growth. Work really hard junior year, or, if you're 2025 sophomore year, just work to improve. The colleges always love the story of the comeback kid. They want to see an upward trend in grades. They want you to be taking increasingly more difficult classes. So I always feel a little sad when some students feel like they've already lost out on the opportunity to apply to selective schools because they had a C freshman year during COVID. And that is not true at all. It certainly is something that you're going to need to explain in your application for those really selective schools, but know that you should always have the opportunity to apply. Standardized test scores are always going to be the second most important thing if you are applying with a score. During COVID, they were accepting a lot higher percentages of students without test scores. Now I would say it feels like it's about 60-40 for the schools that are transparent and report, meaning they're taking 60% of the students that did report scores, 40% without. The downside of only some students reporting scores is there is something like that we call the mid 50% range for standardized testing. So as you look at the mid 50%, for many of these schools, if only the top scoring students are reporting, it's shifting these mid 50% numbers really high. And so often, if you're not sure if you should report or not, I would talk to your school counselor. You can call the admissions rep. The regional admissions rep is always the first reader on your application. Sometimes they will give you a straight response. Usually they're going to give you sort of one of those, whatever you think is best and will represent you best. So know that if you don't report the standardized test scores, that the other elements of your application, which we're going to go through all of them right now, there's going to be more weight placed on them. Sometimes some schools, if you don't have standardized testing, might ask you to deliver or include in your application, or not in your application after the fact, like in your portal, that they'll have you create an essay or some work that you've done for school, just to support that your grades are strong. And I think it's important to recognize here that there's a lot of grade inflation across the world, right? So I don't have the stat at the top of my mind here, but there are some great charts if you Google that show sort of the curve on the number of students that now get straight A's. And so I do think it's really important for these colleges to look and validate that those A's are legitimate. Extracurriculars are critical. And I tell students, as you start to look at it's always great to be involved and engaged at school. But as you start to look at the more competitive schools, there's an expectation, right, that you are engaged and involved. The Common App activity list has 10 spaces, and it doesn't mean that you have to be in 10 things, but that includes extracurricular activities, jobs, any kind of volunteer work that you've done outside of school. You maybe do something at your church. So most students, when we actually go through it, really do have more than they think they do. On the application, you're checking about years you've been involved, hours per week, weeks per year, kind of that depth of involvement. What was your leadership role? So for my, high school students, you're really focused on having leadership. If you are not vice president of the club or captain of the team or whatever, there are other ways to be a leader and be someone who's mentoring people, or figure out ways that you can be a leader for some of your activities, because that piece is important. Essays are a huge part of the application process. So, I mentioned earlier, like the average student I work with will apply to 8 to 12 schools. Let's say you apply to 10 schools. The Common App personal statement is the main application essay that's going to go out to everybody. That is 650 words based on prompts, which for the class of 2024 should be released in the next few weeks. So exciting. And the last prompt is always a catch-all. So you kind of I tell students, don't worry so much about the prompts. Think about who you are and what you want to communicate, and what you can talk about to best communicate what is important to you. But if you have 10 schools on your list, each of those schools some do not, but the majority of schools have a supplemental essay. So you will probably then have another 10 to 15 supplemental essays. Those prompts get released August 1st, but usually don't change a lot year to year. So usually it's good over the summer to sort of draft out what you think you want to talk about, brainstorm ideas with, your as a family, but then think about ways you can repurpose content, because sometimes common themes for essays are why this school and why this major. So you want to be able to have some depth of information that you can talk about, things that you've done over the summer to build connectivity, your major classes you've taken, that type of thing. Letters of recommendation, as I mentioned earlier, as you start to look at the really selective schools, can become a point of differentiation, right? These are 2 core teachers from junior year, as well as your high school counselor, that are writing these letters. All of the universities will not require 2. Some will only want 1 teacher letter, 1 counselor letter. University of Illinois does not look at letters of recommendation, so it really just varies by school. When you set up your Common App in the summertime sometime, you'll be able to load your schools and see what's required. But those letters of recommendation are really, really important. And those will be done by those teachers sometime over the summer and done, will be submitted electronically. You will not see them. You will sign a FERPA waiver as part of your application that they've been done independently and you haven't influenced them in any way. So I do think it's really important that you're building relationships and asking teachers that you're confident are going to say good things. Demonstrated interest is the concept that the universities, again, if you think about them being businesses, want to give offers out to the students that are more likely to attend. And now I'm not talking about the super selective schools, right? Because they can cherry pick. But as you start to look at that next tier of selective schools, you as a university are going to be worried about your yield, right? So if you put 100 offers out there, your yield is the percentage that are accepted. So if you know that it is a school that you're interested in and are definitely going to apply to, you need to let them know that you care about them, right? You are following them on social media, you are on their mailing list, you've done a tour, either virtually or in person, you are engaging with the regional admissions rep, you are opening their emails. I tour a lot of schools as part of my job, which it's so much fun for me, but I will leave and they will say to the students, I'm usually like the only one not there with the student, but please open our emails. We are tracking it. So most of the schools have a software they use called Slate and they're tracking it. They literally, I said, imagine you have a data tracker above your head, right? So you get an interest index score. So the reality is, if they only have a few more spots left, they're reading applications by high school. So all of the students from your high school are coming in and they have a few more spots left. And they're going to look at if there's students with similar grades, test scores, resumes, who do we think has a higher probability of attending? There's an algorithm that calculates that for them. So know that matters. And more importantly, you should be doing that anyway to figure out if that school is the right fit for you, what programs you want to study, that type of thing. So you're not doing it just to demonstrate the interest for that, algorithm. You're doing it to figure out where you want to go. The more selective schools will have interviews as part of the process. Some will be with admissions. The majority will be with alumni or sometimes students that are representing the admissions office. Prep for those. It does matter. Make sure that you are, going into that, even though you think, oh, it's only alumni, they are filling out a report. They have a rubric they have to complete. So I think it's important that you wanted to say all positive things. And then the last bit is standout factor. So as you start to look at those super selective schools and where I said in that slide where we talked about the acceptance rates, all the majority of your competition is going to have near perfect grades, near perfect test scores, really strong resume, like lots of leadership, lots of involvement at their school and outside their school. Sometimes it's like, what is your X factor, right? So the easy ones are sometimes you might be a national chess champion, or you might be some kind of very elite dancer or athlete, a left-handed pitcher. But, for the students that don't have that, it's figuring out, leaning into what makes you special and what you want to do to develop that, right? So sort of a self-guided project. So brainstorm with your child, like, what is it that they care about and how can you lean into that a little bit more and then be able to talk about that in their application. All right. Next bit is the money piece. So how am I on time? All right, so I'm doing 8 more minutes. I'll go through this quickly. So need-based financial aid, there are 2 key forms. The FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. That is focused on adjusted gross income. So they don't care if you have a $1 million mansion or if you're renting an apartment, it is based on your income. And so it's important I always tell families, fill that out the first year your child is going. You don't know what the results are going to be. It's going to calculate. Oh, sorry, I should have said it's you fill it out October 1st of your child's senior year as they're doing their applications. You kind of get all the applications done and out the door. That's your next step. FAFSA is calculating an EFC, which is an expected family contribution. They're actually going to change that name, and I don't remember what it's next year. It's going to be something different, because the reality is that even if the FAFSA calculates that your expected family contribution on a school that's going to be $70,000 a year is 0, that doesn't mean the school's going to give you $70,000. That just means that you're a low-income family. You should be getting some aid, but it's not, it shouldn't be expected. I guess I'll say it that way. Oftentimes the merit scholarships, you will need to complete the FAFSA. So I always just say it's a good idea, get it done. And that way you'll have there. Also, if you're interested in your child having some skin in the game and taking out some of the federal loans that are interest deferred until after they graduate, you have to have a FAFSA on file to do that. CSS profile is a financial aid document that the more elite schools use. And the reason they use this one is this one looks at your net worth, right? It's looking at the value, equity of your house, your retirement accounts, the makes and models of your cars, all of it. And the reason they're doing a deep dive on it is they want to be able to assess who really does have need, because these are the schools that are often meeting 100% of demonstrated financial needs. So I think it's really critical that if you are a family that does have need, that you fill this document out and show that to the school. So part of the reason it's gotten so competitive at these elite schools that meet 100% of demonstrated financial need is a lot of families that do have need. It's like winning the lottery, right? They will meet 100%. So if the cost of that school is $80,000 a year and you have nothing, your child will be, covered. Most of the schools in that bracket read what we call need blind. So they are not going to care if you check yes, that you need money on that application form. The Common App will have that as one of the questions. There are some schools that are in that next category where they're very selective schools, but they read need aware. So if you are someone that is going to need financial assistance or anticipates that you'll qualify for financial aid, just make sure that you understand if a school is need blind or need aware, because that can impact your admissibility. Because sometimes if they don't have the money to give you, they might deny your application just because they know you're going to be looking for money. EFC, I touched on already. And so EFC is basically the financial need piece. I already said this, but being eligible doesn't mean you're going to get the money. And that's usually the biggest misconception, I think, with that. It's based on your tax return for the prior year. So the nice thing is with the FAFSA, there is a data retrieval tool. So as long as you filed your taxes, it links the two. It's actually really easy. So some people come and they're really terrified and it's going to be difficult. And the reality is that you can get the FAFSA typically done in under an hour. The CSS profile is much more in depth and it'll take quite a bit longer. So, and then, oh, there it is. I did put it in here. The student aid index is what they're going to be calling the EFC. So going forward, just to help families understand that it shouldn't be expected. It's an element of the equation, but the reality is that, most of these families, once you get north of about $150,000 for a family of four, it's pretty difficult to get need-based aid from the government. But if you're attending some of those schools that have the deeper, richer endowments, they will offer money as well, typically in the in an institutional aid. So financial aid, I touched on some of these already. The Pell Grant is family $65,000 a year or less. There's some grants related to pursuing certain career paths. So you always want to explore those, that some of them might have income cutoffs and caps. And state of Illinois has something for those low income families called the MAP grant. So if you are a lower income family, you want to make sure you're tapping into all the need-based opportunities. Merit-based for those families that aren't going to qualify is your best bet. So I'll show a few examples in a minute, but typically that's based on grades and test scores. Sometimes there'll be schools that'll do leadership and that type of thing, but more common is grades and test scores. And as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be your biggest money that you're going to see in terms of scholarships. There's also work study, which is for families that qualify for need-based aid. And that is money that your student would get when they work a job on campus and they then, get a paycheck. And so although it's nice and it really helps maybe for covering the cost of food along the way, it's not going to make a huge dent on a, school that costs $40,000 or $50,000 a year. And then the last bit is loans, and I think I already said aggregate loan limit. Just understand that that limit is there and it's broken out, over the 4 years. So it's not like you can say, oh, we didn't save enough, we're going to borrow the full 31 year one and then figure out year 2 through 4. The reality is that it's about $7,500 a year. So you have to sort of plan accordingly. Scholarships, and I think this is an example. This one I left as 2020, just so you could see like things have changed a little bit during COVID, but the typical merit scholarship is based on grades for sure. And then sometimes now with COVID, they can't mandate test scores. So I like to leave this here just to give you perspective of what the scores look like. So if you have an ACT top score is 36. So if you have a student that's scoring a 30, they're going to get around 56,000, assuming they have a 3.5. This is on a 4 scale, by the way. I know a lot of the high schools have 5 and 6 scales. So the colleges are going to convert your child's GPA to the 4 scale. And then if they get a little higher test score, that can mean an additional 20, lots of money. In this case, 24,000 in this example. So although these numbers are not 2022 or 2023 hasn't even released their numbers, right? Understand that there's a difference in sometimes doing some prep for tests. And, Susan, I mean, the little plug gave her a plug in the beginning, like some of those tests that you're going to do, those practice diagnostics the library offers are really, really good for helping your child kind of figure it out before they're sitting down for real live tests. So the more practice they have, taking advantage of all those opportunities is a really good idea. So Alabama, this is another example, right? A student with a 29 and a 3.5 getting 48,000, a 30 and a 3.5 getting 72,000. So and now I think technically Alabama has said that you don't have to have test scores from some of the majors, but know then they are going to be still, if you are applying test optional, going to have some kind of other caveat they're going to put in place. Hope College in Michigan, so 26 ACT, 3.6, 44, 24, 40. So just like every little bit adds up. So if you are somebody that is not a fan as a student of doing prep, just know that it can save you and your family thousands of dollars. So it's really helpful. And this is an example of just the same student. I love these. So Sally student 32 ACT, which is a good score, right? If 36 is the top, a 4.0 GPA. University of Dayton, which is a great school, going to give her 102,000. That's over 4 years. Villanova, nothing, right? So when I talked earlier about looking for schools where your child is on the top side of the, that curve for that school, it's important because you can apply to the same school with the same stats and get a lot of money one place and not a lot elsewhere. Another example, 30 ACT, 3.75, Kansas, Illinois, basically nothing. So Illinois does not really offer merit scholarships. There's something called the AIM High grants. You should Google, there's income caps. I want to say a family of 4 can make up to 150,000, and then they'll give you a nominal amount of money. But in general, that you're getting 0. And then 25 ACT, 3.5 GPA, Kentucky's going to get 40,000. Clemson, same stat, 0. So show me the money is important. Last bits on other ways to save, and then I can wrap up is, you hear all these stories and there's no magic to it, right? It's like the merit money is always going to be the biggest. There's local private scholarships out there. There are some national scholarship search sites. And I encourage your child, like once their applications are done, get on there. Scholly, FastWeb, CapEx, they all have these scholarship search sites. Have them set up a separate email address because they are going to sell their email. And that's how they make money. And then your child can say, I have brown eyes. This is my major. This is my nationality, all these things. And it's kind of leaning into like there's scholarships for everything, red hair, whatever. But the reality is those are usually a couple of 1,000, 2,000. Your high school will have some through the Rotary Club, things like that. But if I tell students, if you fill out, 10 scholarship offers and you spend, 10 hours total and you win a couple, that if you end up with a few $1,000s, that's a much higher hourly rate than you're going to make lifeguarding at the pool in the summer or something like that. So be aware. So juniors, I think it's good to check with your guidance office this year, kind of the senior application, scholarships for seniors are out now. We're working on those actually now. And you want to make sure that you understand, are there service hour requirements? What are the good scholarships? What do I have to need to know now to be competitive? I already talked about the selectivity and money. Midwest Student Exchange is a program that some of the states offer, like in-state tuition reciprocity. So Google that and you can kind of get a sense of the schools that are on there. But I think it's important to know, typically it's the, if you're looking at the universities, it's going to be, though never the flagship university of the state, but it might be like University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, or Whitewater, or Stout, or, you know, one of the more regional locations. Tax credits, so those are, again, typically have income cap outs, but Google that, American Opportunity and Lifetime Learning. Community college, I didn't talk about yet at all, and I am a huge fan. If you did not save for college and it came up much faster than you thought, please consider, we have amazing community college system in our state. College of DuPage is in our backyard. They offer direct pathway programs for students where you go and you take your gen eds and a few requirements and do well, you can have a direct path to like a, you know, pathways for engineering. It's like you getting into University of Illinois. Then you come in as a junior, it's half the cost, but you have the ability to really save money. And no one, whenever people are like talking about their universities and the kids are talking at school, they're always throwing out all these big names, but the reality is that the University of Illinois, College of DuPage is in the top 10 matriculation for the high schools in this area every single year. So there are plenty of kids going there, taking advantage of the savings. I mentioned that already. The average is 5.8 years to graduate. So if you're talking to your child, make sure when they start freshman year, you map out the 4-year plan. Some of the majors have very specific tracks. And if you didn't get the class or maybe didn't get the best grade in the class and have to retake it, you might not be able to take it again until the fall of sophomore year or fall of junior year. So understanding kind of what I guess the results of that are. Yeah, and being an RA is like the best. So RA are basically, I say like the people, the dorm police, right? Kind of keeping everyone on track, but you get free housing. And at some of these universities, that's $20,000 a year. So it has actually gotten, I've heard from a few of the schools, much more competitive to get those RA spots just because of the amount of money and how expensive things have gone. I talked about AP scores already as a huge savings, so I won't reiterate that point. And then the last bit is just us. So we are independent college counseling service and happy to talk with anyone at any time. And Susan, that is it for me, but I'm going to try and go to questions. Are they in the queue for me to see, or are there any questions that people want to unmute and ask, I guess?
Yeah, so feel free, if you have any questions or comments, you can either put them in chat or you can unmute and go ahead and ask. There's a lot of information that Kim provided tonight, so I'm sure we're all kind of percolating.
Sorry, I was trying to go fast, so I had time for questions. So hopefully it is a little overwhelming, though, I know sometimes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, I did have a question and it just went away. Let's see, we heard about schools being anti-Asian. Is that true?
No, I mean, I don't think, I know there's a lot going on, right? There's a huge lawsuit going on right now too, right? In terms of the whole racial profiling, but I think that it's definitely, I wouldn't say anti-Asian at all. I think it's really important to on your application state what your nationality is, and you know, the reality is that it's competitive for the Asian population. It's competitive for a lot of the Caucasian families. If you have some ethnic diversity, it definitely can benefit your application, but unfortunately, Asian is not one of them. I don't know that it's a detriment, but it definitely is not, you know, a diverse group they're looking to target. They already get a lot of Asian applicants.
And they are asking if we'll be able to get a copy of the slides to send out.
Yeah, so if you
you send them to me, Kim, I can send them out to everybody who registered.
Right. Sure, that sounds good.
Okay. Any other questions?
Everyone is tired and it's Thursday and it's going to get cold tomorrow too. So prepare. I just saw it's getting cold again. So thank you though. It was really great. And feel free to, email me to, I think the slide deck has our general email, the information email with any questions as well. So.
Great. Well,
Nice
thank you,
to
Kim.
meet you.
As always, it's a pleasure. You outdo yourself every time.
Oh,
So
you're so sweet. And knowledge is power, right? So you have to just be knowledgeable. So good luck to everybody. Good luck to particularly the juniors. And remember, get it done over the summer.
all right. Thanks so much,
Okay,
Kim.
take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.